Chapter 1. The sun shone politely, warm but never overbearing, upon the village of Fernwood, a tucked-away jewel in the English countryside. The hedgerows were neatly trimmed, the cottages wore climbing, roses like necklaces, and the air held the scent of honeysuckle and just-mown grass. On the lawn of the Fernwood Hall estate, a table had been laid with precision. Starched linen, polished silver, delicate cucumber sandwiches, and cakes that leaned towards the decadent. The occasion was the annual Fernwood Fund for the Forgotten Gardeners, and every lady upstanding had brought her best china and her sharpest opinions. Miss Jane Marple sat beneath a striped parasol, knitting needles flicking with unhurried grace. She was not a native of Fernwood, merely a visitor of her dear friend Mrs. Isabel Nash, but her presence had not gone unnoticed. To those unfamiliar, she was a gentle elderly lady with a fondness for tea and patterns, both in her stitching and in human behaviour. As the rector raised a toast to preserving the horticultural soul of Fernwood, murmurs rippled more from social obligation than enthusiasm. Mrs. Nash leaned closer to Miss Marple and whispered behind her gloved hand, "It's all very charming until someone dares plant lilies where roses belong." Miss Marple smiled softly. Village life has its traditions and its tempests even in teacups. A few feet away, a strained laughter drew her attention. Lady Margaret Compton, widow of the late Sir Everard, stood too stiffly by the punch table. Her expression was composed, but her hand trembled slightly as she held her glass. Across from her stood a man with striking grey sideburns and a voice that seemed to clip the air. Mr. Alton Sedgwick, local magistrate, and a man whose enemies never quite outnumbered his investments. "They do say," Mrs. Nash murmured, following Miss Marple's gaze, "that Lady Compton regrets selling the South Orchard, but the ledger was quite clear. It belongs to her husband's estate, and debts do not vanish on sentiment." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Yet sentiment often clings to land or ledgers." Further down the garden, a sudden burst of laughter rang out. Veronica Bell, the young secretary of the parish council, was entertaining a group of eligible young men with tales of her weekend in London. She wore city fashion just a hair too bold for the countryside, scarlet lipstick, a yellow dress that caught every glint of sunlight. "She's spirited," said Mrs. Nash, not quite approvingly. "She's observed," said Miss Marple, knitting without looking down, "more closely than she likely realizes." As the tea flowed and the cakes vanished, tensions simmered just beneath the surface. Quiet glares exchanged over scones, unsaid histories hidden in polite nods. It was a tableau Miss Marple had seen before. Beneath every rural calm lay buried resentments like weeds under gravel. It wasn't until Mr. Edwin Hartley arrived 5 minutes late, with dust on his lapel and a face like curdled milk, that the atmosphere shifted. The village accountant, always punctual, always immaculately groomed, was the sort of man who valued decimal points more than conversation. He arrived breathless, avoided eye contact, and declined tea. Miss Marple, her eyes on her knitting, simply said, "Odd." "What is, dear?" asked Mrs. Nash. "That a man who prides himself on balance appears so off-kilter." Before the party wound down, Mr. Hartley had excused himself. A few noted he was pale. Fewer noted how Lady Compton watched him go. a flinch flickering at the corner of her mouth. By the time the final chairs were stacked and the last crumbs shaken from napkins, no one had spoken a word of crime. Yet Miss Marple felt it, the faintest unease, the imbalance in the rhythm of village life. Something was being hidden, something already begun. As she walked back with Mrs. Nash along the lavender-edged lane, Miss Marple remarked, "It was a lovely gathering, wasn't it?" Mrs. Nash nodded. "Yes, apart from the rector forgetting his own hymn verse. And apart from Mr. Hartley, who seemed rather unlike himself. Oh, yes, strange that. Perhaps he's ill." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple quietly, "though I've rarely seen illness leave dust on one's coat and guilt in one's shoes." She didn't elaborate, and Mrs. Nash didn't press. But as the wind turned just slightly cooler, and a crow called once from the distant copse, Miss Marple knew. In Fernwood, something had begun unravelling, and someone already knew they could no longer hide it. Chapter 2. The next morning, Fernwood awoke to the low hum of gossip, not the lively kind exchanged over fences, but the tense, sharp variety that passed in quick, lowered voices. A curtain twitched on every street, and the air, though crisp with the scent of dew-soaked hedges, felt unsettled. It was the housekeeper at Eastview Cottage who first raised the alarm. Mr. Edwin Hartley hadn't come downstairs. His blinds were still drawn at 9:30. Unusual for a man who'd always been seen crossing the lane by 8, with his collar neatly pressed and a ledger under one arm. Mrs. Nash was already buttering toast when her maid entered with the news. "Mr. Hartley's been found dead, madam." The toast paused mid-spread. "In his study. They say his door was locked from the inside." Mrs. Nash turned sharply to Miss Marple, who had just poured herself a cup of Darjeeling. Miss Marple didn't flinch. "Dead?" she echoed softly. "They say heart failure," the maid added quickly. "Dr. Armitage said it looked quite natural." Miss Marple stirred her tea, her expression unreadable. Heart failure, perhaps, though I wonder what might have burdened it. By mid-morning, the village had entered a subdued state of activity. The constable had cordoned off Mr. Hartley's cottage, and Dr. Armitage's motor car sat outside with a dusting of petals on the bonnet. People came and went, most of them hushed and hesitant. Mrs. Nash, ever socially dexterous, had arranged for a condolence basket to be sent by 10, and was already composing a note for the ladies' committee. Terribly sad, a bachelor, wasn't he? "Yes," said Miss Marple, setting down her cup, "but not without entanglements." They walked together through the High Street, where talk now clustered in pockets like cold fog. The grocer's wife said she saw Mr. Hartley arguing with someone 3 days prior, though she couldn't say who. The vicar mentioned how Hartley had been anxious about figures lately, whatever that meant. And Miss Veronica Bell, seen at the post office just before noon, looked quite pale as she passed by, nodding too quickly at everyone she encountered. Miss Marple, ever observant, noted how no one dared mention Lady Compton by name, yet her absence from the morning's calls was noticed by all. They reached the cottage's gate just as the constable stepped out, brushing down his sleeves. "Routine visit, Miss Marple. Nothing suspicious at first glance. Locked study. Doctor says heart failure. Likely overwork." "Overwork," Miss Marple echoed. "I thought Mr. Hartley prided himself on balance." The constable looked sheepish. "Well, yes, but Things pile up, don't they? Indeed, she said, peering at the windows, especially if one's work involves other people's secrets. Inside the study, according to the constable, things were in their place. A green-shaded lamp still glowed faintly on the desk, an open ledger beside it, and Mr. Hartley slumped over, his hand resting near a fountain pen. No signs of struggle, no forced entry. A neat scene. Too neat, perhaps, Dr. Armitage ruled. Out poison, the constable added. No strange odours, no vomit, nothing of the sort. Said it looked like he just stopped. Miss Marple nodded absently, more interested in the details left unsaid. A man like Hartley, obsessively tidy, rigid in habit, wouldn't have left his ledger open midway. Nor, she suspected, would he have left a smudge of ink drying on the margin, as Mrs. Nash had heard from her maid's cousin, who'd peeked in from the garden. They passed by the post office on their way home. Veronica Bell was just emerging, a telegram clutched tightly in her hand. She smiled too brightly. "Terrible news, isn't it?" she said, voice brittle. "I mean, Mr. Hartley. Who would have thought?" "You knew him well?" Miss Marple asked pleasantly. "Oh, no, not well. I mean, he did my taxes, I suppose. Once, that's all." Her glance flicked toward the cottage, and then quickly away, and Marple smiled kindly. "We're all touched by such losses in small villages. Even those we barely know become part of our rhythm." Veronica hesitated. "Yes, I suppose they do." And with that, she walked briskly down the lane, heels clicking far too loudly for the silence of the moment. That evening, as the wind curled through the hedgerows and dusk painted the village in greys, Miss Marple sat with her knitting untouched. The pattern could wait. Her thoughts were elsewhere. "Locked room," she murmured. "No violence, no witnesses. A man with secrets, and too many people pretending not to know him." Mrs. Nash glanced up from her embroidery. "You're thinking again, aren't you?" "Only observing," Miss Marple said gently. "There's always something odd in the natural. People say, 'How strange,' when what they mean is, 'I wish I hadn't noticed.'" Outside, the bell of St. Bartholomew's chimed 7. Inside, Miss Marple looked toward the fire and said very quietly, "It wasn't his heart." Chapter 3. By the following afternoon, the shock of Edwin Hartley's death had settled into the bones of the village like a damp fog. It wasn't just that a man had died, it was the quietness of it, the ease with which it happened. People didn't like quiet deaths in Fernwood. They gave too much room for thinking. At the greengrocer's, Mrs. Stroud whispered to Mrs. Kittredge that it was certainly the ledgers. "He knew far too much," she insisted, piling apples into her basket, as if judgment could be staved off with fruit. "People say money troubles, but I think it's more than that." Across the lane, the shutters on Lady Compton's house remained half-closed. She had not taken visitors, nor had she sent word. This, in itself, sparked no small number of comments. "Grief," said the vicar gently when asked. "Private people mourn privately." "Or hide things," murmured Miss Marple, seated in the rear pew, just loudly enough for her companion to raise a brow. Miss Marple had taken to walking each morning, always with purpose, never too slowly. She stopped not at the usual gossip corners, but in quieter pockets, where one might hear things rather than be told them. On this particular morning, she called on Miss Gilda Pym, the late Mr. Hartley's closest neighbour, and a woman who had perfected the art of observation under the guise of tending marigolds. Such a shock, Gilda said, ushering Miss Marple to a seat near the garden-facing window. He was at his desk every morning, never late. I'd see the lamp go on through that little corner pane, always at 7:30 sharp. Did you see it the morning he passed? No. Gilda hesitated. Come to think of it, no, I didn't. But that doesn't mean anything, of course. Perhaps I simply wasn't looking. Or perhaps he was already gone. Miss Pym's fingers twitched on the edge of her teacup. Well, yes, I suppose so. But I do remember there was someone, a figure, around dusk the evening before. I saw movement in his front garden, thought perhaps it was him out for air. But the posture was wrong, too upright, and no hat. Edwin always wore his hat outdoors, very precise about that. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Did you mention this to anyone? Oh, no. I wouldn't want to start rumors. Rumors are simply truths told before their time, Miss Marple said quietly. Later that day, Miss Marple made a polite call on Reverend Penrose at the vicarage. His drawing-room smelled faintly of old sermons and lavender polish. They spoke of the deceased, of course, and of the upcoming harvest fair. But Miss Marple's questions were careful, deliberate. Did you know whether Mr. Hartley kept any charitable records for the parish? She asked, as the vicar poured tea. Oh, yes, he replied, very thorough. He handled our books each quarter, even audited the church flower fund once. And did he ever misplace anything? The vicar blinked. Good heavens, no. Edwin was dull as a biscuit, but honest. Was, Miss Marple repeated softly. From the vicarage she walked to the post office. Mrs. Ellison, the postmistress, was polishing the brass slot when Miss Marple entered. Busy morning? She asked kindly. Oh, Miss Marple, I shouldn't say, but it's all very strange. Mr. Hartley had a parcel due, never collected it. A parcel? Yes, arrived 2 days before he passed. Registered post. No one's claimed it yet. Do you recall who sent it? Return label said A. Sedgwick, Hastings. That'd be Mr. Alton Sedgwick's brother, wouldn't it? Miss Marple nodded slowly. The magistrate. And a parcel. She stepped out into the street just in time to see Veronica Bell speaking to someone near the bakery. The man wore a tan coat, unfamiliar to Miss Marple. The girl's expression was tight to alert. She spotted Miss Marple, turned a fraction too quickly, and waved with more cheer than the moment required. Later, back at Mrs. Nash's, Miss Marple did not speak much over supper, but her thoughts were a quiet flurry. A hidden visitor the night before a death, a parcel from a name tied to local power, a young woman watching every move with the wariness of someone holding a delicate truth. Mrs. Nash noticed her silence. You're winding something up in your mind, she said gently. Miss Marple placed her spoon down. Winding? No, unravelling, I think. She sat in the lamplight that evening, reviewing her notes, not on paper, but in memory, a ledger of her own compiled from glances, half-said phrases, inconsistencies in the rhythm of life. Veronica Bell had lied, clumsily, but with purpose. Lady Compton was silent but not grieving. Mr. Hartley had seen someone before he died, and someone else had taken great care to ensure he wouldn't speak again. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Nash answered it, and returned with a puzzled expression. "That was Constable Briggs. He says the coroner's changed his mind. Something about the blood tests not matching a natural death. There's to be an inquest." Miss Marple nodded once. "Then someone," she said, "is starting to worry they left a thread dangling." Chapter 4. 2 days after the news of the inquest, Fernwood no longer whispered. It buzzed. The idea that Mr. Hartley might not have died naturally unsettled the village in ways no death ever had. There was something about accountancy, about numbers, and books and locked doors that made people uneasy when they turned sinister. At the church meeting that morning, half the parishioners couldn't focus on the hymns. The other half, like Mrs. Ellison and Mrs. Kitteridge, took turns trading theories in the vestibule. "It's the parcel," Mrs. Ellison whispered, glancing toward the pews. "I still say something, and it frightened him." "It's the woman in the yellow dress," Mrs. Kitteridge countered. "Those city types always bring trouble." Miss Marple, seated 3 rows behind, said nothing. She did not trust theories built on fashion. She preferred the untidy threads left in tidy stories, and Fernwood, it seemed, had dropped one more. That afternoon, Constable Briggs visited Mrs. Nash's home under the pretense of a routine update. His real purpose, however, was thinly veiled. "He asked me to look into Mr. Hartley's records," he said over a biscuit. "Seems the estate papers are missing something." "What sort of something?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "A ledger, the one marked for the church accounts, gone." His shelves were very precise, everything labelled, except that one. Nash raised an eyebrow. "And no one removed it officially?" "Not that we know of." Miss Marple stirred her tea. "Perhaps it was removed unofficially. People tend to erase what they fear might be discovered." Briggs shifted in his chair. "Lady Compton sent word today. She wants to meet. Says she has information, but didn't want to come to the station." Miss Marple's knitting paused. "Did she mention what kind?" "No, just that it's related to the missing document, and that someone else might already be looking for it." That evening, under the faint glow of the gas lamp at Compton House, Miss Marple accompanied Briggs. Lady Compton received them in a silk dressing-gown that shimmered like a bruise, blue-black with plum shadows. Her face was pale, but her eyes were alert, cautious. "I will not pretend Edwin and I were close," she began, once they were seated. "But he handled certain sensitive accounts after my husband's death." Miss Marple listened without interrupting. "There were funds, untraceable at the time, used to purchase parcels of land in someone else's name. I believed the South Orchard to be part of that. Edwin once hinted he had kept copies. A shadow ledger, he called it. Something off the official books." "Why would he do that?" Briggs asked. Lady Compton met his gaze. "Insurance, I imagine. Against whom, I never dared ask." Miss Marple leaned forward just slightly. "And did you ever see this second ledger?" "Once, a year ago, in his study. He put it away when I arrived." "Did anyone else know?" She hesitated. "Alton Sedgwick. They were in quiet talks last spring. Something about an overdue audit for the council. Sedgwick didn't want scrutiny." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And you think this shadow ledger still exists?" Lady Compton drew a breath. If it does, someone will do a great deal to keep it from surfacing. After they left, Miss Marple remained unusually quiet. The constable walked her home, politely declining a second cup of tea. Once inside, she sat by the fireplace, not knitting this time, but holding a folded paper in her hand, an unsigned note that had been left at Mrs. Nash's doorstep that morning. Not natural, not alone. Look behind the curtains. The handwriting was slanted, rushed. The paper smelled faintly of lavender, water, cheap, not the kind Lady Compton wore. Miss Marple's eyes shifted to the fire, flickering low. She had seen lavender water on Veronica Bell's desk once, months ago, at a ladies' committee meeting. She had thought nothing of it. Now she considered its weight. The next morning she requested permission to visit Mr. Hartley's study, under the pretext of reviewing parish documentation. Briggs, now openly deferential to her instincts, agreed. Inside the cottage, the study was still sealed. Dust lingered in the corners, and the faint smell of dried ink still hovered near the desk. Miss Marple moved slowly, precisely. The ledgers on the shelf were undisturbed, neatly aligned, uniform in spacing, all except for one section near the corner, where faint marks in the dust showed that a book had recently been removed. She turned to the window. The curtains were thick velvet, drawn back. She ran her hand behind the fold. Her fingers found the edge of something hard. A key, small, brass, and tucked into the inner lining with care. She held it up to the light. On its base was a tiny etching. L.C. Lady Compton, or ledger cabinet, turned to Briggs, who stood by the door. Where was the cabinet for private storage? He blinked. There was a small chest under his bed, locked. We assumed it was personal effects. Miss Marple's mouth curved just slightly. Sometimes, she said, we lock things not to protect them, but to give ourselves time before they're found. Chapter 5. The key was a modest thing. No grand design, no heavy brass flourish. It felt cold in Miss Marple's palm, like something deliberately made to disappear if needed. She slipped it into her reticule and turned back to Constable Briggs. I believe, she said gently, we ought to look under Mr. Hartley's bed. Briggs blinked. We thought that cabinet was just for personal things. Letters, old receipts. Miss Marple smiled faintly. It often is. And yet those are exactly the things we hide when we believe no one else should see. Back at Eastview Cottage, the air was heavy with neglect. The fire had long since gone cold, the kitchen bare save for a forgotten apple bruising slowly in a bowl. They entered the late accountant's bedroom. Neat as always, but impersonal. A man who lived by routine, not warmth. The bed was square, the blanket folded precisely at its edge. Beneath it sat a modest wooden chest, the kind one might miss unless looking for it. The key clicked in with an almost theatrical sense of ease. Inside were 3 bundles of old envelopes, a faded photograph of a woman whose face had been scratched out, and at the very bottom, wrapped in brown paper, a ledger bound in navy cloth. No title, no markings on the spine, just a name on the first page, E.H., Private Holdings and Adjustments. Briggs let out a low whistle. Well now. Miss Marple didn't respond. She gently turned the pages, scanning neat columns of handwritten notes. But they weren't mere figures, they were annotations. Payments marked with dates and initials. F.C., Withdrawn, no explanation. S.B. Large deposit from unknown account. V.B. Inquiry into back pay discrepancy unresolved. V.B. Miss Marple said softly. Veronica Bell. Briggs guessed. Miss Marple didn't answer. Further down the page, a short entry stood out. Different ink, newer handwriting, a hastier scrawl. Pressure from A.S. to close South Orchard matter. Unwilling. Discrepancies remain. Risk too great. Must secure a copy, separately. Briggs leaned over her shoulder. A.S. has to be Alton Sedgwick, the magistrate. Miss Marple's eyes didn't leave the page. And Edwin Hartley was preparing to protect himself. They returned the ledger to its wrapping. Miss Marple slipped a page, one with 3 initials circled in ink, into her sleeve before closing the lid. Back at Mrs. Nash's, dusk was just beginning to settle. The oil lamps had been lit early. Shadows moved across the parlor walls like silent eavesdroppers. Mrs. Nash, always quick to read a mood, offered no pleasantries when Miss Marple returned. "Well?" she asked quietly. Miss Marple sat beside the fire. "There's always a moment in these cases," she said, "when the truth begins to reveal itself, not through what is found, but through who starts to panic." That evening, a letter arrived at the constable's office. Anonymous like the first note Miss Marple received, but this one was different. It read, "He knew. We all knew. Ask her about the ledger." She saw it first. Below the line was a small drawing, an ink blot in the shape of a teacup. The next morning, Miss Marple did what no one expected. She called upon Veronica Bell. The girl answered the door, herself, surprise flickering across her face like a gust of wind through curtains. "Miss Marple, I thought we might talk, dear, about ledgers and Mr. Hartley." Veronica's lips pressed together. "I really don't know much about either." And yet you once received a check from him, 2 months ago. Back pay from your committee work, wasn't it?" Veronica's eyes narrowed. "He kept good records." "Yes, especially of things people hoped he wouldn't." They sat on the narrow settee. Veronica's flat was tidy but lived in. Books stacked neatly, a mirror slightly cracked in one corner, and a vase of wilting carnations near the window. "Didn't kill him," she said suddenly sharply. "I didn't say you did." Veronica's hands twisted in her lap. "He promised he'd help me. There was something in the books, something off. I told him I saw discrepancies in the parish fund, but he said it wasn't safe to bring it up yet. Said he needed time to get proof. But then he changed, went quiet." "Because someone warned him," Miss Marple murmured. "I suppose so." Veronica's voice dropped. "I only told one person." "Who?" Veronica hesitated. "Lady Compton. She called me to tea. Said she was worried about perceptions. Said I needed to learn how Fernwood worked if I wanted to stay." "And she asked about the accounts?" Veronica nodded slowly. "Just casually, but when I told her what I suspected, she changed the subject immediately. Then, 2 days later, Hartley stopped returning my notes." Miss Marple rose. She glanced once at the cracked mirror, then at the wilted carnations. "I believe, dear, you were quite right to worry." As she left the cottage and stepped into the golden hour's light, her thoughts turned again to the initials, the ink, and the faint shape of a teacup drawn in a nervous hand. Everything was starting to align, quietly, inevitably, but someone she knew was about to act desperately. Chapter 6. By the following morning, Fernwood was tense in that peculiar way only English villages can be. Too quiet, too still, as though the hedgerows themselves were waiting. Miss Marple rose early. She had slept little and dreamt even less, though her thoughts had churned with unspoken names and uncollected truths. The ledger now sat hidden in a locked drawer in Mrs. Nash's parlour, its entries more potent than any weapon. It was not the presence of secrets that unnerved Miss Marple. It was how many people already seemed to know they were being watched. She stepped out into the fog-lined morning and made her way to the post office. Mrs. Ellison was behind the counter, lips drawn, eyes watchful. "They say someone broke into the magistrate's study last night," she said without preamble. Miss Marple tilted her head. Really? How uncharacteristic of Fernwood. They didn't take anything, apparently, but left the desk drawers open, the constables asking questions. She lowered her voice. "And Mr. Sedgwick is livid." Miss Marple nodded politely and paid for 2 stamps she didn't need. By midday, the village had reached its emotional tipping point. It was Mrs. Nash who opened the door to the vicarage's maid, breathless, cheeks flushed. "You should come," she gasped. "There's been another." They arrived at Compton House to find Constable Briggs already at the scene, her jaw tight, boots planted in the gravel like a man bracing for storm. Lady Compton's housekeeper, pale and shaking, explained in whispers, "I went up to bring her the newspaper, as always, and I found her on the floor of her sitting room, slumped in the chair, cold, eyes open." Inside, the once majestic room felt stifled. Heavy drapes muffled the daylight. Lady Compton lay just beneath the window, her gown a pale ivory, hands folded unnaturally still on her lap. Briggs stepped forward cautiously. "Doctor's on his way. Looks peaceful. Could be natural, like the first, but—" Miss Marple approached slowly, quietly, her eyes flicking not to the body, but to the half-finished tea-tray on the sideboard. 1 cup, 3/4 full, the other untouched, a third missing. She turned to the housekeeper. "Did anyone visit her this morning?" The woman hesitated. "Mr. Sedgwick stopped by, around 10. Said it was personal. They argued. I didn't hear words, just the tone. He left quickly." Miss Marple bent beside the tea-tray. On the saucer beneath the half-empty cup, she noticed a faint ring of white sediment around the rim. "Too fine for sugar, too neat for cream." Briggs leaned in. "Poison?" Miss Marple didn't answer. Instead, her gaze shifted to the writing desk in the corner. A small blotter had been turned over hastily, a pen still uncapped beside it. She reached forward and gently lifted the blotter sheet. The imprint beneath showed a half-written sentence, "If anything should happen to me," and then it broke off. Briggs swore softly under his breath. By evening, the doctor confirmed what Miss Marple already suspected: traces of digitalis in Lady Compton's blood, a rare dose, one that mimicked heart failure, but left subtle signs for trained eyes. Back at Mrs. Nash's cottage, the mood was unusually heavy. Even the fire in the hearth crackled reluctantly. Mrs. Nash stared at the carpet. two in less than a wink, both to do with that infernal ledger. Miss Marple nodded, hands folded. And someone very much wants to rewrite the record before it's read aloud. She withdrew the page she had removed earlier from the hidden book. Briggs had seen it once, but now, in the quiet of the evening, its significance deepened. 3 initials had been circled, A.S., V.B., and, most curiously, R.C. Miss Marple tapped the last one gently. "Do you know, dear," she said softly, "the vicar's middle name is Charles." Mrs. Nash frowned. "Reverend Penrose? Records show the church fund was misallocated last quarter, quietly, and only by a margin. Edwin Hartley made note of it, but no official report was ever filed." Mrs. Nash gasped. "Surely not. I don't believe the Reverend is capable of murder, but someone close to the matter is." A knock at the door cut through the air. Briggs stepped inside, hat in hand. "There's something you need to see." He led them to the rear garden behind the village hall. A gardener had discovered it, a torn fragment of ledger paper buried beneath the compost heap, ink smudged but legible. "If exposed, the council will collapse. A.S. insists on silence. V.B. threatened to go public. I suspect someone else is watching me. I've hidden the second ledger." Miss Marple stood motionless. "There were 2, she whispered. 2 shadow ledgers." Briggs's jaw tightened. "Then where's the second?" She turned slowly, where Hartley would hide something no one would look. Her eyes settled on the church, not the altar, not the pews, the hollow base beneath the vestry floor. Chapter 7. The sky hung low the next morning, a dense pewter sheet pressing down on Fernwood's tiled roofs and creeping ivy. The church bell rang for morning prayers, though fewer arrived than usual. Grief, it seemed, had a way of muting faith, or at least redirecting it to whispers in kitchens and glances across gravelled lanes. Miss Marple arrived at St. Bartholomew's just after the bell ceased. She wore a pale grey shawl and carried nothing but a folded paper in her handbag and a mental map of every clue she had yet to speak aloud. Constable Briggs met her on the chapel path, eyes slightly reddened from lack of sleep. "Are you sure about this?" he asked quietly. "No," Miss Marple replied. "But then certainty is for those with nothing left to fear." Inside the church, Reverend Penrose waited in the vestry, thin and unusually stiff, his collar pressed to perfection. His eyes darted toward the floor more than once. "I must say," he murmured, "this is all quite irregular. Faith is often tested by the unexpected." Miss Marple replied, eyes gently scanning the baseboards and the floorboards beneath his feet. Eyes gently scanning the baseboards and the floorboards beneath his feet. Briggs cleared his throat. "We'd like to examine the foundation beneath the vestry, Reverend. For structural purposes, of course." The vicar hesitated. "It hasn't been accessed in years. The hatch hasn't opened since the war." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And yet it opens." Reluctantly, the vicar fetched the iron key from the wall. He unlocked the wooden hatch at the far end of the vestry, revealing a narrow staircase descending into cool darkness. The air smelled of limestone and something older. Mildew, perhaps, or memory. They descended in silence. At the bottom, Briggs's torch beam cut through the gloom. Miss Marple stepped lightly over the uneven stone. Her eyes scanned the walls, the corners. Then she stopped. Near the far alcove, a section of the wall bore faint scuff marks. She reached forward and pressed gently. A brick moved. Behind it, a small cavity had been carved into the wall. Tucked inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was another ledger, older, heavier, marked in faded ink, E.H. Confidential Miss Marple accepted it with a quiet exhale. As Briggs opened the cloth and flicked through the first few pages, Miss Marple stepped back and let her gaze linger on the walls. "He hid the first ledger, to leverage," she said softly. "But this one he hid for posterity, in case the other was found first." Briggs read aloud. "Council misallocation, signed off by Sedgwick. Unexplained loan, Compton Family Fund. And this? VB threatened exposure, promised protection, regret involving her." Miss Marple's voice didn't rise. "He meant to shield her, Veronica Bell. He thought the first ledger would suffice. But it didn't," Briggs said. "Someone wanted them both gone." They climbed the stairs in silence. By the time Miss Marple returned to Mrs. Nash's, word had already spread, not about the ledger, but about Veronica Bell. "She's vanished," Mrs. Nash said as the door closed behind her. "Didn't arrive for the committee luncheon. Her room was left in perfect order, except—" Miss Marple waited. "She took nothing, not even a coat. Just gone." That evening Miss Marple stood again in the quiet of the parlour, the fire crackling low beside her. The second ledger now sat beneath a clean linen napkin on the table. She hadn't read all of it, only the final page. "If I disappear, it won't be by choice. I've hidden too much. But if they come for the ledgers, they'll already be too late. The truth is buried where faith meets fraud." She turned the phrase over in her mind like a stone in her palm. By the next morning, Constable Briggs had sent word to every nearby village watch. No sign of Veronica, and no movement from Alton Sedgwick either, who had suddenly taken ill and refused visitors at his home. Miss Marple spent the morning quietly walking the outskirts of Fernwood, where fields met hedgerows and foxgloves grew wild. And then, near the vicarage gate, she paused. A bicycle, abandoned just off the path. The front wheel bent, a red scarf snagged in the bramble. Veronica Bell's. She knelt beside it, inspecting the ground. Two distinct footprints, one larger than the other. One pacing, the other staggered. Not an accident, a meeting. She returned to the cottage without a word. That evening she penned 2 letters, one to the Chief Inspector in Caldershire, the other, unsigned, slipped through Alton Sedgwick's post-box just after dusk. The letter read, "You left fingerprints, and someone watched you do it. The ledgers speak louder than Hartley ever could. Tomorrow, all will be read aloud." She folded her shawl and poured herself a cup of tea. The game, she knew, was nearly over, and the next move would not be hers. Chapter 8. The next morning dawned damp and windless. Fernwood held its breath. By midday, a murmur had begun to spread that Alton Sedgwick, Fernwood's sharply dressed magistrate and unspoken force behind every local decision, had been seen leaving his home, not at the station, not at the vicarage, but wandering the southern edge of his estate, where the garden wall backed into the narrow path that bordered the orchard. "Walking?" Mrs. Ellison asked, her brows lifted as she passed Miss Marple near. "The grocer's. Loitering," Miss Marple corrected gently, adjusting her gloves. That afternoon, Miss Marple took a very particular walk. Not along the high street or through the churchyard as usual, but along the back path of the Compton estate, where Veronica Bell's bicycle had been found. The ground, though damp, still held the faintest impressions from the day before. One pair of footprints deeper than the other. A scrape in the dirt as though someone had tried to drag something. Or someone. She paused beside the garden wall. A small bench sat beneath an ancient yew tree, weathered but firm. She sat and waited. A quarter-hour passed. Then she heard the scrape of boots. Alton Sedgwick rounded the hedge corner, startled to see her seated there. He wore a dark coat and clutched a cane he didn't seem to need. "Miss Marple," he said, too quickly. "Taking the air." "Very refreshing," she replied calmly, "and good for the constitution." He hesitated, unsure whether to continue past or retreat. "I do admire this corner of the village," she added. "It has such a private quality." Sedgwick's jaw tensed. "It's rarely used." "And yet someone recently did." Her eyes flicked to the base of the garden wall. A faint scrap of red fabric remained snagged in the ivy. His gaze followed, then darted away. "I wouldn't know." "Mr. Sedgwick," she said lightly, "do you recall your last visit to Lady Compton?" He didn't answer immediately. "I was offering condolences. We disagreed on council matters, but I respected her." "You raised your voice," she said. "Her housekeeper heard you." His nostrils flared slightly. "I'm sure you didn't expect Mr. Hartley to keep a second ledger," she continued, watching him now as one might a chessboard, or to write down quite so many names. "Yours, of course. Hers. Even poor Veronica's." Wickham stepped back. "You have no right." "No, of course not," Miss Marple interrupted softly. "But the truth has a way of stepping over such boundaries." He said nothing. "Veronica's missing," she added, her voice even. "We found her bicycle. The wheel bent, a scarf in the bramble, and 2 sets of footprints. Yours was one." Sedgwick's mouth twitched. "That proves nothing." "No," she agreed. "Not yet." She let the silence stretch. The wind stirred the ivy gently. Somewhere beyond the wall, a crow gave a single caw. Then she said the thing she'd been saving. "She's alive." He froze. Miss Marple rose, dusted her skirt. "You didn't kill her. You frightened her. She ran. But someone saw where." For a moment the mask cracked. He turned sharply toward the hedge, as if half expecting to see someone emerge. But there was only green. Miss Marple didn't follow his gaze. She looked directly at him. "The ledgers will be read at tomorrow's inquest. Every name, every transfer, every contradiction. If she does not appear before then, your guilt will be presumed, not just in misappropriation, but in murder." "I haven't," he began. "Then bring her back," Miss Marple said gently, "before the village decides for itself." She left him there, standing beneath the yew, pale and uncertain for the first time. That night she did not sleep. Briggs returned just before 10. Out of breath and visibly shaken, we found her. Miss Marple looked up from the fire. Stuart was hiding at the groundsman's cottage just outside Compton Hill. Sedgwick dropped her there 3 nights ago, said it was for her protection. She refused to leave, didn't trust anyone. Does she now? She does you? Miss Marple nodded once. Then bring her to me. They met in the parlour at Mrs. Nash's. Veronica looked tired, hollow-eyed, but resolute. He didn't hurt me, she said first. But he said everything would fall apart if I talked, that the council would collapse, that it would ruin him. He begged me. Did he threaten you? No, not quite. But he knew I was scared. He made sure I stayed that way. Miss Marple studied her a moment. And the ledgers? I knew about one, not the second. But Hartley told me enough. She looked down. I only wanted the truth. And now 2 people are dead. Miss Marple reached forward, took her hand, and, because of you, the truth will outlive them. The next morning, the ledger was turned over to the chief inspector. The inquest would proceed. But Miss Marple knew the true reveal had yet to come. The killer still thought they had escaped the noose. But the trap had already closed. Chapter 9. The inquest was set for noon, but the village was already awake by dawn. Shops opened early with half-hearted enthusiasm. Curtains twitched like nervous blinks. And in St. Bartholomew's churchyard, the benches were unusually full. Miss Marple arrived a few minutes before the proceedings were to begin, walking arm in arm with Veronica Bell. The young woman wore no makeup, her face bare and composed. She no longer looked like the eager, laughing girl from the village fete. There was something new in her, a quiet resilience. At the front of the chapel, Constable Briggs and the chief inspector reviewed the contents of the second ledger, which had been delivered in full confidence the night before. Though only a few names were slated for public discussion, everyone present knew the web had spread wide. Alton Sedgwick arrived late. He took his seat without a word, and avoided every eye but one, Miss Marple's. She did not look away. The inquest began with formalities. Cause of death reaffirmed as digitalis, poisoning. Hartley's, still pending full toxicology, was under renewed suspicion. Then the inspector stood and announced that, due to evidence received in the form of 2 ledgers, the investigation had been reopened. A wave passed through the chapel like a wind through dry leaves, but Miss Marple wasn't watching the room. She was watching who stopped breathing when the inspector said the ledgers would be read, and she saw it. The smallest hesitation, a caught breath, a downward glance, not from Sedgwick, but from Reverend Charles Penrose. She turned slowly and folded her hands in her lap. Afterward, Miss Marple declined a ride home with Mrs. Nash. Instead, she asked for 10 quiet minutes in the vicarage garden, and she requested gently that Reverend Penrose join her. They sat on a worn bench beneath a vine-covered arch. Miss Marple did not speak at first. She allowed the stillness to deepen, to settle over them. Then, softly, "You were very quiet today, Reverend." He smiled thinly. "These matters are not for clergymen to speak on. And yet clergy have always handled sins, haven't they? Even those of arithmetic." He stiffened slightly. "I don't believe you poisoned anyone," she continued, "but I do believe you saw something you have not spoken of." He turned his head. eyes suddenly full. I didn't know it would go so far. She waited. 3 weeks ago, he began, voice barely a whisper. Hartley came to me. He said he had found inconsistencies, one involving the church fund, a small discrepancy. I told him to delay, that I would speak to the council privately. But you didn't? No? His face tightened. I mentioned it only to Lady Compton. I thought she might know how to handle it discreetly. She told me not to worry, that she would speak to him herself. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And that's when she involved Sedgwick. He looked up sharply. I imagine she promised to clean it quietly, she added. And when Hartley refused to stay quiet, Sedgwick decided to act. Veronica was a complication. So was the second ledger. Reverend Penrose's hands clenched in his lap. Do you think I helped them? No, she said kindly. But you gave them time. Sometimes that's all a murderer needs. He lowered his head. Will I be arrested? No, but you will need to tell the inspector everything. And you will need to live with what you chose not to do. They parted in silence. That evening, Miss Marple sat with Briggs in the parlour at Mrs. Nash's. A quiet knock came at the door just before 7. It was Sedgwick. He did not ask to come in. Instead, he held out a folded letter. Eyes dim. For her, he said. Veronica. Briggs took it without speaking. She trusted me once, Sedgwick murmured. That's what made her dangerous. He walked away before they could reply. Inside, the letter was a short note and a bank slip. A deposit made to Veronica Bell's name. An attempt, perhaps, at restitution, but Miss Marple knew it for what it was. Guilt. Too little. Too late. She turned to Briggs. Tomorrow I'll speak. At the hearing? No, she said. At the tea room, where people truly listen. He almost smiled, and as she rose to close the drapes, the evening wind carried with it the faintest breath of closure. But not justice. Not yet. That would come with the final piece. And it, Miss Marple knew, had already been laid in motion. Chapter 10. It was just past 9 when Miss Marple arrived at Eastview Cottage again. The property remained quiet, its windows shut tight, its garden slightly overgrown since Edwin Hartley's death. Constable Briggs unlocked the door with deliberate care. Everything's been left as it was, he said, stepping aside for her. Miss Marple moved through the cottage as though walking backward through time, the scuffed rug in the hallway, the faint chalky stain on the stair rail. She had noticed it before, but had not thought it strange. Now she did. In the study, the air was still stale, and the small desk lamp sat where it had been found, its green shade now dulled with dust. Would you mind, dear? She asked Briggs, lighting the lamp as it was found. He did so. The desk illuminated in a circle of yellowish green, casting shadows that glared into the corners of the room. Miss Marple leaned down to the blotter. The cup of tea was removed when the body was taken, she murmured. But there was one. Briggs nodded. Yes, half full. No saucer, none reported. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. That's rather telling, don't you think? Mr. Hartley was meticulous. I doubt he'd serve himself without one. She reached into her handbag and removed the page she'd copied from the second ledger. Not the names this time, but the times entries Hartley had logged just before his death. "Look," she said, pointing. "This final notation, time-stamped just before 8. That contradicts the doctor's estimate of death by nearly an hour." "You're saying he was alive after the time they thought?" "I'm saying someone may have altered the scene to match that belief." Briggs straightened. "You think it wasn't just poisoning?" "No," she said softly. "I think it was staged." She moved behind the desk and studied the carpet. Her foot tapped lightly until it struck something subtle, just beneath the desk's shadow. She crouched, reaching down to tug gently at the rug's corner. A shallow indentation, as if something weighty had once rested there. "A second chair," she murmured. "Removed after, perhaps hastily." Briggs exhaled. So someone was sitting with him at the moment of death. "And perhaps helped him drink the tea," she said, "or poured it themselves." She rose slowly. There was trust involved, or habit. No signs of struggle, no forced entry. It had to be someone he accepted as a guest. She turned toward Briggs, her voice steady now. "I believe Mr. Hartley died a full hour later than assumed, that the poison, digitalis, was given to him in a dosage precise enough to resemble cardiac failure. That the person who administered it arranged the desk and left, locking the door behind them." "But how?" Briggs frowned. "If it was locked from the inside," Miss Marple smiled gently. "There's an old sash window behind that curtain, remember? Painted shut, but not latched." Briggs moved quickly, pulling aside the curtain. The window creaked with age as he tested it. It didn't open fully, but enough, big enough to slip a key through, he murmured. "Indeed. Or a hand. If someone knew the way Mr. Hartley placed his spare key just inside the sill, they could lock the door behind them, slip out the window, and pull it mostly shut behind them, enough to pass as sealed." Briggs looked stunned. "So, who then?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "Someone who had reason to fear exposure from both ledgers. Someone who visited that night. Someone whose name appears twice in the final entries." Briggs's eyes widened. "Lady Compton?" "No," Miss Marple said. "She tried to control the damage, yes, but I believe she was being threatened as well. Hartley knew too much. But the person who killed him? It had to be someone who could move freely in the village, who knew Hartley's habits well enough to stage the scene." She let the silence hang, then added quietly, "Someone who took communion with him every Sunday, and who sat in that very study 3 days a week to discuss parish matters." Briggs blinked. "The vicar?" Miss Marple nodded. "Reverend Penrose." Briggs hesitated. "But he's the one who talked. He confessed to being weak." "Yes," she said. "But he didn't confess to murder. He framed it as inaction because he wanted the appearance of guilt without the stain of it. A careful strategy. Guilt in small doses garners sympathy. But the real clue—" She moved to the sideboard, where a silver communion tray still rested among Hartley's estate items. "This," she said, lifting a small silver cup. "Its rim was polished just yesterday. Briggs, you said so yourself. And yet—" She held it to the light, a faint sticky residue on the lip. "Digitalis, from a shared surface." "Miss Marple," Briggs whispered, "you're saying—" "Poison delivered with devotion," she said grimly, and then the scene altered. Under cover of priestly duty, Outside, the sky darkened with gathering clouds. Somewhere, a bell rang. Not a funeral bell, not yet, but the hour. Miss Marple turned from the study and toward the door. Cherbills, the inspector. The inquest will need one more name. Chapter 11. The following evening the vicarage was silent save for the soft creak of floorboards as Reverend Penrose crossed from his study into the small sitting-room. As Reverend Penrose crossed from his study into the small sitting-room. He had not lit the lamp. He sat in shadow, as if hoping stillness could shield him. He did not react when Miss Marple was shown in. She removed her gloves delicately and took the seat opposite, her eyes gentle, her posture straight. "I hoped it, wasn't you?" she said softly. "I suppose that makes two of us," the Reverend replied. His voice was calm, distant. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "I was quite prepared to believe you weak. A man who turned a blind eye. I even pitied you for that. But it wasn't weakness, was it? It was strategy." He looked at her, unblinking. "You always were sharper than people believed." "You counted on that, didn't you?" she continued. "That people would believe you incapable of more than passivity." He gave a slow nod. "If I had been louder, more aggressive, if I'd had a temper or a reputation for ambition, I wouldn't have lasted a year in this parish. The village doesn't trust loud men of God." "You delivered the poison through communion. It seemed appropriate," he said without irony. He had taken too much, from too many. "And Lady Compton, she died for her own sins. But no, I didn't kill her." His eyes flickered briefly. She was frightened. She had agreed to go public, to admit her part. I imagine she drank the tea without realizing what was in it. Perhaps someone thought she would ruin the arrangement before it was in place. "You mean Sedgwick?" He didn't reply. Miss Marple studied him in the dim light. "You were clever. Poison with no struggle. A rearranged scene. Locked from the inside, but not impossible. And gilt cut just enough to confuse." She stood slowly. "But you left a thread dangling. A communion cup, unwashed. A time stamp on a ledger entry. A second chair pulled away too quickly." The Reverend gave a tired smile. "I always thought Hartley would be the end of me. Kept everything. You might have survived the financial misdeeds," she said. "But once Veronica found the pattern, and once Lady Compton turned against you, you felt cornered." "Better one death," he said softly, "than 3 reputations destroyed. Hartley had no family, no future, and no right to forgive you," she finished. He looked away. Briggs entered then, quietly, respectfully. He said nothing, simply waited. Reverend Penrose stood, straightened his collar. "I won't resist." "I didn't think you would," Miss Marple said. As they stepped toward the door, he paused. "Will the village know?" "They always do," she replied. "They'll forgive what they must, but not what they choose." Briggs led him into the night. Miss Marple remained in the vicarage a moment longer, letting the silence settle. It was a familiar stillness, like the one that follows a storm. Not peace, exactly, but pause. She turned toward the desk. On it sat a small black book of Psalms, and a note scribbled beside it. "The truth is not always the sermon they wish to hear." She left it undisturbed. Later that evening, back at Mrs. Nash's, the fire crackled softly as Miss Marple poured a final cup of tea. Veronica Bell arrived just past 8. She sat beside Miss Marple, not speaking at first. "I heard," she finally said. Miss Marple nodded. Veronica stared into the flames. "I still feel like I'm carrying it." "You are," Miss Marple said gently, "but not alone, and not forever. I wanted to save him." "You did," Miss Marple said. "More than you know." They sat in silence for several moments, longer. Then Miss Marple added, almost as an afterthought, "The most dangerous sins are rarely violent. They're tidy, quiet, folded in ledgers." Veronica looked at her. "And still, you caught him." "No," Miss Marple said, her eyes distant. "He caught himself. I merely set the mirror down." Chapter 12. It rained the next morning, the kind of slow, steady drizzle that blanketed Fernwood in a hush. Shop fronts opened with less clatter than usual. Even the birds seemed hesitant. The Reverend Charles Penrose had been escorted out of the village just after sunrise. Briggs, tight-lipped but pale, had carried out the task personally. No cuffs, no scene, just a coat, a lowered head, and the quiet withdrawal of a man whose place had been at the centre of a community he could no longer return to. Mrs. Kittredge said she wept. Mrs. Ellison said she didn't believe it, and the vicarage's front door remained ajar for much of the day, as if no one quite knew what to do with its emptiness. In the parlour at Mrs. Nash's cottage, Miss Marple sat at her usual spot, teacup in hand, knitting untouched in her lap. "You always said the quiet ones were the ones to watch," Mrs. Nash murmured. "No one ever believes that," Miss Marple replied gently, "until they do." Veronica Bell arrived just before 10, a scarf tied loosely at her neck. Her posture was straighter now, her speech more measured. She looked less like a girl and more like someone who had been forced too quickly to become something else. "They've offered me a position," she said, sitting lightly on the edge of the armchair, "in Caldershire. Not just clerical, real work." Miss Marple smiled softly. "Then I hope you'll take it." Veronica hesitated. "I'm afraid they'll know what happened." "They may," Miss Marple said, "but they won't know who you are." Outside, the sound of footsteps on wet stone. Briggs appeared at the threshold, removing his cap. "It's done," he said quietly. "Penrose has made a written statement. No trial. Likely to be kept quiet, for the sake of the diocese." "And Sedgwick?" Miss Marple asked. "Resigned. Left for Hastings this morning. No charges, just shame." Miss Marple gave a small nod. Briggs lingered. "He left this," he added, producing an envelope. "Addressed to you." Miss Marple opened it only once she was alone. Inside was a folded letter in heavy cream paper. The handwriting was immaculate. "Miss Marple, you were never the enemy. You simply saw what others did not. You did not destroy me. My choices did. You did not destroy me. My choices did. That's the part I failed to understand until too late. Perhaps that's the true crime in all this. Not what was taken, but what was willingly abandoned in the name of reputation. There are no good men in ledgers, only the ones who balance better than others." She folded it carefully and tucked it beneath the saucer on the table. No triumph filled her, no sense of victory, just a stillness. A closing of a book whose pages had frayed long before she read them. That afternoon the villagers gathered, less formally than a funeral, but more solemn than a meeting. Reverend Penrose's departure left a void that even gossip could not fill. Miss Marple was asked quietly if she might say a few words in the chapel, not as priest, but as witness. She declined. Instead, she sat in the second pew from the back, as a substitute clergyman offered a brief prayer. He spoke of loss, of change, of difficult truths. But it was Veronica Bell's quiet movement to the pulpit afterward that silenced the room. She didn't read a passage. She didn't speak of Hartley, or Penrose, or even the events directly. She said simply, "Some people hide their wrongs in closets, others put them in books, but we carry them just the same." And then she stepped down, walked past the congregation, and out into the rain without an umbrella. No one followed her, not because they disapproved, but because they understood. After the gathering, Miss Marple and Mrs. Nash walked home in silence, the gravel soft beneath their feet. As they reached the front gate, Mrs. Nash asked quietly, "Do you think it will happen again? Something like this?" Miss Marple looked out toward the village. "Yes," she said at last. "Not here, perhaps, not soon, but yes. Because where there is silence, there is always something waiting to be spoken." They entered the cottage, and the door closed behind them with a soft finality. Outside, the rain continued, steady, measured, and cleansing. Chapter 13. 3 weeks passed. Fernwood settled, not back into innocence, but into something quieter, older. The kind of peace that came not from forgetting, but from knowing. The morning post arrived with the usual dull rhythm. Bills, notices, and one envelope, cream-coloured, and sealed with an official mark addressed to Miss Jane Marple, care of Mrs. Isabel Nash. She opened it without urgency. Her tea was still warm, and the spring sun had begun to push gently through the kitchen curtains. Inside was a letter from Chief Inspector Cleves. Miss Marple. Following the conclusion of our inquiry into the deaths of Edwin Hartley and Margaret Compton, and the investigation of Reverend Charles Penrose, I can confirm the Crown has officially closed the case. The confession provided by Penrose, together with the physical evidence from the vestry, the communion vessels, and the corroborating statements, has satisfied all legal requirements. The forensic re-examination of Hartley's body confirmed the presence of digitalis in quantities consistent with intentional poisoning, introduced no more than 30 minutes before death. Your assertion regarding the locked room and window access was also verified. The second ledger, found by your direction, contained entries now verified against archived council records, several of which are being independently audited. Alton Sedgwick has not been formally charged, but his resignation and financial restitution were accepted. As always, your ability to perceive what others overlook has proven vital to justice. Respectfully, G. Cleves. Chief Inspector, Coldershire Division. Miss Marple folded the letter and tucked it beneath the teapot. She didn't need to read it twice. The truth, once seen, rarely faded. Outside, the village moved at its usual pace. A boy rode past on a bicycle with a muddy back tire. Two women paused at the bakery window, discussing rhubarb tarts. Even grief, it seemed, made way for appetite eventually. Veronica Bell stopped by just after noon. She wore her travelling coat and gloves and carried a small brown valise. "I thought I ought to say goodbye properly," she said. "I'm taking the post." Miss Marple smiled, and rightly so. Veronica hesitated. "You've been very kind to me. I don't think I'd have come out of it all in one piece without you." "You would have," Miss Marple replied, "but perhaps with a few more bruises." They shared a quiet moment. Then Veronica handed her a small parcel. "Was Hartley's," she said, "found tucked in the church record shelf, with my name on it. Strange, isn't it?" Miss Marple opened it after she left. Inside was a single notebook, thin, bound in soft leather. Hartley's handwriting marked the first page. To Miss Bell, should she ever need to prove herself right. "You saw it. They didn't. That matters." Miss Marple placed it beside her teacup and breathed in slowly. At twilight, Briggs joined her on the bench beneath Mrs. Nash's wisteria. The blossoms had begun to bloom again, pale violet and scenting the air. "We've had no trouble since," he said. "Feels like the village is holding its breath, but in a different way." Miss Marple nodded. "Did he ever say why?" Briggs asked. "The Reverend, I mean, beyond the ledgers." She was silent for a long moment. "Some men lose themselves, not through greed, but through fear," she said at last. "Fear of disgrace, fear of exposure. He was ashamed of what he had covered up, of what he'd benefited from, so he chose to act before it was all taken from him. But murder never buys silence. It just delays the echo." Briggs looked down at his hands. "Will you be staying in Fernwood?" "Oh, no," she said lightly. "St. Mary Mead calls me back, but Fernwood will linger." That evening she packed her small travel case, her knitting needles, a pair of letters, the second ledger, now sealed in a manila envelope for the archives, and the thin notebook Veronica had left behind. Before she closed her case, she placed a small pressed sprig of wisteria between its final pages, a reminder that silence has scent and memory and consequence, and that even in the softest corners of England the truth leaves marks.